With all of the complaints to make about various metagames, sometimes it's time to stop and smell the roses. The roses in this case are these 6 decks that I think are really cool and really underrated and are managing to be successful at high infinite in the hands of some really good players. We're going to start with this iteration of a Pixie list from the aptly named Pixie Chef, who you may recognize from various streams. Pretty much a Pixie one-trick, which means that they have a lot of experience with various different combinations of cards, and the one that I think I really like that this deck is doing and trying to take advantage of in a meaningful way is the combination of Pixie, a lot of one-drops, and Black Swan. This means that you have access to powerful plays both with and without Pixie, because you'll be cheating energy anyway, but if you manage to swap a Pixie card to a one-cost 6-drop, you end up getting truly astronomical power multipliers in a really cool way. So what that means is Black Swan is going to look at the actual cost. So if you mess up and you end up making one of your one costs too expensive, it'll still end up free when you Black Swan it. Side note, for those who are unaware, this is because whenever a text refers to one cost with a dash in between it, it's talking about the actual number written on the card and not the number that you see on the card modified by whatever cost modification effects you have. Khazar, for example, will buff one cost cards regardless of whether or not it costs 2 to play them. In much the same way, Black Swan will make one cost cards cost 0 even if they actually cost 6 because they swapped with something big. The other thing that I like that this list does well is generally be a solid curve-out deck. This is a deck that can, at baseline, use Luna Snow to accelerate into an early 6-drop that can be meaningfully disruptive to your opponent and then close the game with some Juggernaut Sage plays. That kind of stuff is really strong at baseline, and I think what this deck does well is it manages to bridge a sort of powerful, overarching nut draw endgame with a deck that still manages to consistently play most of its cards. One of the things that's particularly troubling when you're trying to deck build with something like Pixie is you want to make sure that you're using your energy efficiently both with and without Pixie, and that can be pretty difficult to actually make happen because, you know, Pixie's such a big difference in how you actually use your energy. And so having cards like Luna Snow in here, like Black Swan in here to sort of bridge the curve and make sure that your baseline low-level output is much higher, I think is a really good way to approach deck building with a card like this. Now, notably, there are some big weaknesses. A deck like this does not love seeing a lot of Mobius and Mobius, and unlike other Pixie decks, is not really running its own Mobius. Instead, Black Swan and the extra energy you have is your mitigation for, oh my god, all my cheap stuff is actually way too expensive. And that is good. You get this final turn, a bunch of cheap ones that you used as fodder for Pixie. They end up being free anyway, and so that means that you could do all of this output. But Black Swan in games without Pixie is still going to boost your output significantly. It's not the greatest thing in the world, but nobody's really playing around the, oh, it's turn 6, Red Hulk plus 3 other things, right? Like that kind of thing is very hard for people to actually deal with if they're playing a relatively fair deck. And so you have a deck that has this ability to put a lot of points on the board, both with and without Pixie, and the bridging of that via Luna Snow and Black Swan is what I like so much about this deck as it's put together currently. You may notice a couple of Pax borders popping up in my other decks. Finally, we are bridging out thanks to Ryan from Pax. He ended up letting me have some extra Pax borders, exactly 12, enough to use on one deck. I had to choose a deck that I thought would be a good enough deck to play, but also wouldn't have much overlap with my other decks so as to minimize the appearance of it in my otherwise uniform purple border decks. The deck I chose was this, which is put together by Derek, and it's very siloed off in its own section of the metagame. I refer to it as Pax Screamana because I'm kind of like reading a lot of Roman history right now because I'm weird, and Pax as in Pax bundles, I'm hilarious. What this deck is trying to do is very, very fair. Like, fundamentally, the issue that Scream decks have is that they are playing too fair. That is consistently an issue that they have. All of these cards are fair. They are good, but they are fair. And that means that you can run into real problems when people are doing things that scale multiplicatively, or just have bigger guys than you, or are slightly more unfair than you, but are still fundamentally fair and are just able to outscale you in ways like that. When you run into a bunch of decks that just have naturally high point ceilings, it's hard to play Scream. So how do we fix this? Well, those matchups typically don't involve a lot of big guys. So we fix this by playing Wave and then some really big guys. Wave plus Miles final turn is like a legitimately cool and powerful play that you can make in a deck like this. Sorry, I should clarify. Waved 6-drop plus Miles final turn. That kind of stuff is legitimately quite interesting. Another card that could make sense here is Hydra Bob over Kingpin, in deference to that wave final turn play, where your goal is really to just go 4 cost 6 and then 2 big ones, as big as the ones can actually get. And your job there is to say, like, look, I'm playing a relatively fair deck. I'm going to keep them on a relatively fair basis, and then I'm going to slap a slightly unfair endgame onto it in the form of this wave deck. And I think the important part about the wave right now is not that wave is incredibly good or anything, but that the decks that you're targeting here are not able to take advantage of it in the same way that you are, right? You are playing against decks like the version of End of Turn that is all 4-cost cards and below. They get absolutely nothing out of you playing a wave. You are using this against decks like Victoria Hand. They get absolutely nothing out of you playing a wave. And so you end up having multiple matchups where you are a little bit behind just on base power level, that wave ends up being effectively one-sided and gets you closer to that power level needed. You must be this tall to ride, and she effectively comes with very little downside in a lot of those matchups and makes you this tall to ride. There are a lot of decks in Marvel Snap that this deck doesn't want to see that are more than the sum of their parts, because their parts added together scale them above what this deck is able to match. Almost all of those decks are playing mostly small cards and get absolutely nothing out of your wave. And that is what this deck is trying to take advantage of. You know I can't resist a good Goon Knight. I always appreciate a method of attacking the hand in a meaningful way. Moon Knight represents this in a powerful and genuinely solid shell, the Agatha shell. I feel like I see a lot of different versions of Agatha Ghost Rider stuff happening right now from the updated Danish Hela. A lot of the cards that have come out recently have not been incredibly influential. The one that I think has been the most influential is probably Red Shift, because of decks like this. Being able to be such a powerful Red Shift into big stats, into Cosmo Juggernaut, stop your interaction, or disrupt you in meaningful ways. Play Fenris Wolf, play Moon Knight, discard the Agatha. That kind of stuff is just really, 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 really powerful. The one thing that is a big downside for decks like this existing, and I think it is really, really important to note this, is there's a lot of normal people playing Fenris Wolf. Like, Fenris Wolf is a very popular card right now and probably should honestly be on their radar. And this kind of deck, if you don't have priority and they have a Fenris Wolf, they get your Agatha. The other thing that I think is awkward about this deck's positioning right now is that as more people start playing the cringe deck that I posted yesterday, you're going to run into some worse matchups, honestly. I have not felt good about the matchup from this side of it against that deck, not just because they're a Fenris Wolf deck that gets Agatha, but also because they're a Shang-Chi deck. They are just very often able to actually outpoint you by Shang-Chiing one lane or Fenris Wolf Agathaing something. Like, they just seem to be able to make that happen more often than not, leaving you a little bit more reliant on Legion scamming them out of it somehow, which is possible, but it doesn't particularly feel great. You're more reliant on your Disruption, Negasonic, and Goon Knight, and that kind of game is a little more touch and go. It does not feel like a very favored matchup, and that's not even getting into the part where they could, like, Killmonger your Black Knight if they have priority before you actually get anything off of it. There's just a lot of small, meaningful interactions that go against you when you're playing this deck into the sort of meta cringe agglomeration that exists right now. And while I do think that this is a very powerful deck when it does work, if you're going to be a deck that doesn't necessarily always work, and also when you do work, you might not even be able to beat the big, scary meta cringe deck, that is an awkward spot to be in. But what this deck does do is absolutely stomp on a bunch of other stuff. If you play this deck, you will be genuinely surprised at the power level and consistency that you can get to here. And it actually does take meaningful advantage of the Agatha interaction, where this is a card that starts in your hand. So that means you almost always are actually going to be able to do like Juggernaut plus Negasonic or Juggernaut plus Cosmo or whatever it is to protect your gains early into this game. You have a lot of power potential when you have your Black Knight Redshift stuff, and then you also have the ability to slam the door shut at the end of games. To absolutely nobody's surprise, Gamer believes that Supergiant is currently underrated. After seeing a brief rise in popularity thanks to the power of the end of turn decks, Supergiant has mostly returned to obscurity. A little bit of a face-down card, if you'll pardon the pun. Now, what this means is that Supergiant is now a deck that people aren't particularly prepared for. And that means that as long as people still are playing decks that care deeply about end of turn stuff, you actually can counter them with this still, and it just seems like it's become a less profitable thing to do. That counter comes naturally, though. You don't need to go out of your way to make it happen. It just happens. You just get that for free. So what Supergiant also does is have a very powerful and technical final few turns. The hardest thing about this deck is playing through the various permutations of things that can happen with Supergiant. It asks the most of you in terms of deck-specific knowledge, and it's why I think this deck is very often underplayed relative to its actual power level, which is normally quite high. This is just a hard deck, but more than just being a hard deck, it is asking you specific questions about what your experience level is, not just with your deck, but with your opponent's deck. What is your understanding of what they are doing? What is it that you need to plan? You need to think of turn 5 and turn 6 as the same turn. You need to be like, I know what they're doing on turn 5. I'm going to make sure that I counter it perfectly, and then I'm going to do the same thing on turn 6. And if you walk that tightrope, there is no deck that will feel more rewarding to you. This is one of the best feelings in Marvel Snap when you are able to put together the exact right. It feels like lock picking. It feels like you're picking a lock when you win a game with the perfect positioning and reads based on what your opponent has played on the first 4 turns and what you expect their face down turn 5 to be. Obviously, Daredevil, cheat code if you're trying to pick the locks. He does have some awkward snap implications. It's very difficult to snap after you've Daredeviled, for example. And I think that that can carry him a bit downwards in terms of people's estimation, but there is some incredibly powerful stuff that this deck has access to. The ways in which it uses priority and lack of priority in order to make sure that certain tech cards hit certain targets is unique to it. And it is one of the most rewarding deck archetypes to learn because of all this hyper-specific deck knowledge that is really only relevant in this archetype, which means that when you run into a good player with a deck like this and a bad player with a deck like this, you can really see the difference. I got this list from my resident Cerebro expert, Jay Walla, but he said he got it actually from Jeff Hoagland. And the innovation here is cutting Claw and cutting Frigga and relying on just the base power of a Cerebro deck to actually make this work. The way this deck is trying to function is to recognize that we're in a relatively lower power environment. We don't want to be doubling our Cerebros until we can afford to double our Cerebros. So we don't want to get Shang-Chi'd more than anything else. And that a board full of 7s, and if we can get them to 10s, they're 10s, is actually just going to be good enough to beat like most things in a metagame like this. Most things in this metagame are very specific. They're trying to do super linear but interactive stuff. And this deck is saying like, look, hold on, man, cut that out. What if all of my cards are just bigger than yours? And I think C5 actually has a similar argument where it's like, I don't know if you've ever played one of the sort of meta cringe decks into C5, but you don't beat them. Like, if they play, like, Wave into Doctor Doom, you just sit there and look at them and you're just like, oh, yeah, that, like, if you play a Cerebro, that's just way more points than I can ever beat. And I think that's really interesting. Like, we're in this sort of low points base metagame where, like, all of these, like, you know, I'm going to play my little, like, Iron Patriot and I'm going to play Gladiator and all that. And it's like, that's, like, the biggest card in my deck is Gladiator. All of this kind of stuff kind of falls apart in the face of just like baseline raw power that is hard to interact with. And I think both C4 and C5 can exist in that space. And I think honestly C3 can too, but I don't know if that's underrated enough to make this video. So that's what we're talking about C4. But generally, I'm a little higher on this than you probably would think because I've played against it with all of my little cringe meta decks and lost. And it's just like, oh, wait. I don't have the points to deal with this. I simply cannot do it. And I think that's a really funny space to be in. One of the things I've noticed is a lot of the Invisible Woman decks are like going a Fantastic Car route rather than like the full multiplicative Prodigy route. Like that kind of stuff is falling off. And so when you're doing that, it's like, oh, you know what? I actually just don't beat a bunch of 4s that are 7s or 10s. All right, I guess I die, right? And that's to say nothing of the really cool stuff that can happen, like the competitive advantage that I think this deck has that is mostly Esme, and now it gets to be a Mobius deck. And of course, we also have Prodigy. This ability to like back multiply your stuff. Prodigy is just better than Mystique. Like that is just a better card than Mystique. You should be able to make it happen. And that is really, really powerful right now. Turns out numbers are good. Last up is a list from, I believe, Crazy, adopting a piece of technology that I helped introduce into the metagame way back in Golden Gauntlet 1 with Uncle Ben Killmonger in your Pixie deck. Now, when I originally pitched this to Butt with the list that he ended up bringing to top 4 Golden Gauntlet 1, the idea was basically, we can't afford to not be a Killmonger deck in this metagame. And if we are going to be a Killmonger deck in this metagame, we just need a 1-drop that actually works with the guy. And I think that this is a really cool direction to take it because it leans even further into that by playing the Hood. And then it leans even further into the Hood by playing not a Misery, but an Annihilus package. And I think that's just a really, really, really cool additional innovation on top. I am generally a fan of this kind of Pixie deck that is built around core strong cards, but also recognizes key things about the metagame, like we need to play Killmonger right now. I personally think that Killmonger is sort of like the metagame secret weapon. There's just always at least 1 or 2 good hits in every single game. He's incredible against end of turn decks. He's incredible against V-hand decks. If you can manage to throw priority, they care deeply about their 1/6s. This is a card that is elite in multiple ways, and going out of your way to fit a package that includes him into your Pixie deck is a worthwhile endeavor. So, with that said, I think this is a legitimately powerful other direction to take Pixie stuff. It might actually just be better. It looks like it's playing straight up just really good cards consistently. And I appreciate the deck building on display here because it's saying, okay, what does it take to get the Hood into this already sort of existent Uncle Ben and, of course, Killmonger Pixie list. Now, previously, the reason for this was we really needed it to just beat Thanos. Now, Killmonger, it feels like, is not as important against specifically one deck, but is very good against a variety of good decks. And I really like that this has taken the Killmonger package with Uncle Ben in the Pixie list, added Merlin, added the Hood, added, of course, Annihilus and Sentry. Just some really powerful and interesting stuff going on here. I like it. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for watching. As always, I have been KMBest. You have been phenomenal. I hope you enjoyed this look at some underrated and off the wall and powerful deck lists. Have a wonderful day.